What's going on, folks, and welcome back to some more Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. Today we're going to be doing a simple recap video for what happened during the Goblin Adventures livestream a few days ago. This featured 6 members from the development team of Visionary Realms. We had Minus on the Rogue, Sacred on Direlord, Savanya on the Monk, Madakai on Shaman, Uxia on the Cleric, and Ronik on the Enchanter. They had starter weapons for the first part and had some beefier weapons in the inventory if they needed to use them later, with each character being level 10 while only Sacred himself was level 11. They started it off by immediately dropping down to the lower area in the Goblin Cave, which right away puts them against tougher enemies closer to their level. Because they were in development mode, they were able to see the exact level of the mobs, but keep in mind that this normally wouldn't be the case for the rest of us. The level of the creatures were somewhere between 13 and 15 from what I can remember, but the ones they fought at the start fell into the category of 12 to 13. The first thing they kind of talk about as they're fighting goblins is the weapon technique system. To start with, you'll notice that in contrast to other games, the hotbar only consists of 2 sections, giving you a limited amount of skills and abilities to choose from. This means that not only for weapon techniques, but even class abilities, you have to pick and choose which ones you'd like to incorporate into your limited hotbars, also referred to as the limited action set. And it's quite likely that you may find a bit of uniqueness in builds, even among people using the same class. The bottom section of this bar is normally used for more offensive abilities and attacks, while the top is more utilized for self-buffs and group utility that can be useful against your enemies. Where the weapon technique system fits into all of this is that on top of your class abilities, the longer you use your individual weapon of choice, the more weapon skills you can unlock for it. This system is one that I like to compare to Guild Wars 2 because in its final form, using the same weapon but on different classes should allow you to gain access to different weapon techniques over time. So if you're using a dagger on a rogue versus a wizard, you might see some of the same baseline techniques, but the more advanced ones will be class specific. They also mentioned during the stream that even some of the class and core abilities will need to be found or bought out in the world. You won't have access to all of them just from the trainer alone, so it will definitely pay off to do a bit of exploring. In addition to this system, Minus also brings up some of the new changes regarding the readiness system. This is essentially an energy resource that can be charged during and sometimes out of combat encounters to be executed by various weapon techniques for your class, while opportunity can be used for more class-centric abilities you gain access to. One of the newest changes since the last time they spoke about it is that now the abilities will use whatever readiness you have. So instead of needing to save up to use them in general, you can now execute them early or wait to get an even bigger effect from a fully charged bar. For all of you rogue lovers out there, a minor detail mentioned around 15 minutes is that you will be capable of using stealth in combat when you stop engaging a mob, and something I noticed throughout their other showcases is that as a healer or caster character, you should be able to also sit in the middle of combat while not directly engaged to begin regenerating your resources. But as Joppa mentioned later in the stream, this won't happen right away. Your character will begin ticking towards a rested state, which will then allow you to start regenerating once that fully begins. Something I mentioned in a previous video, which is something we've been seeing during every fight in the showcase, is that when mobs start to get lower and lower in health, they'll begin to run away to avoid complete death. It'll be important during these times to either focus them down or utilize ways of crowd controlling them, because if you have a mob start running into mobs close by, this could cause a chain reaction, and next thing you know, you'll have several more mobs to tangle with and could likely die. However, with their group composition, the Enchanter class makes it so that if something like this were to happen, they'd have a much better chance of survival. Because Pantheon is aiming to be a spiritual successor to games like EverQuest, you're going to see classes that only have the role of pure support make a comeback. So far the confirmed ones I've seen are Bard and Enchanter, but they might have plans for another one waiting in the wing I just haven't seen yet. As an example of why the Enchanter is useful, the Mesmerize ability from their toolkit allows you to essentially put one of the enemy mobs to sleep, which can be broken by direct damage or just over time, but it makes it much easier to control the battlefield, especially if you end up pulling more than one at a time. This isn't an Enchanter's only useful tool, however. They'll also be capable of calming enemies to greatly reduce their aggro range, help allies regenerate mana, debuff enemies, buff allies, and so much more. They even mentioned during the stream that because they do have an Enchanter, they could potentially switch up the roster to feature only one healer instead of 2, and swap the second heals for an extra DPS such as Wizard. And that's something you'll notice while playing Pantheon, is that you don't always have to approach a situation with the same composition in your party. I've even heard stories about EverQuest on how players could take entire parties of casters and other unique matchups to progress through various forms of content. The next point of interest during the live stream starts directly around the 20-minute marker when the entire party decides to take off their lantern belts. This allows the viewer to see just how dark the dungeons can be in Pantheon, and why it's crucial to utilize lantern belts, torches, or even the Mage Light spell. Keep in mind that during the Pantheon Difference livestream, Joppa mentioned how some foes might end up with the Dark Foe disposition, which will cause them to aim for and snuff out other light sources, meaning that in my mind, in those cases it could be beneficial for only the tank to have a lantern active, that way the mob shouldn't flip-flop on aggro trying to snuff out all the lights at once. Around 22 minutes and 30 seconds, it's also mentioned in response to a question regarding how realistic the combat will be for classes, that at this current time most of the classes we see in game are designed for levels 1 through 20. At this time the VIP testers are still assisting with feedback and balancing, but the main point that Minus puts across is that each class in its final form should feel completely unique from the others. Closer to the 31-minute marker, a question gets asked, how will Pantheon's combat differ from EverQuest? To which Minus replies that there's a lot that will make it so. There will be synergies that allow classes to play off of one another, the intelligence of NPCs, also known as NPC combat tactics, different attributes they can have, also known as dispositions and traits, things like Bloodthirsty or the Dark Foe disposition. But aside from that, what we're seeing here is very early gameplay, and we're not going to fully understand the depth of these classes or the game itself at level 10. The game is going to grow in depth. This game is going to put you in a lot of situations where you have to pick between different choices, and it'll be very important to understand how people play. Around 36 minutes, the team also gives a quick snippet of what you'll experience while playing the Cleric, and why it's best for them to normally stay in melee range. The first example they gave is how in combat in Pantheon, there's a cooldown before you can start regenerating mana to help counteract this. Clerics have an ability known as the Tome of Initiate, and this allows them to regenerate 1 mana point every time they do a melee strike. Another skill they mention right after this is known as Fateful Strike, which allows the Cleric to heal a target they have a bond of faith with anytime they use this skill in melee range. This is also around the exact time frame they drop down to a deeper level in the cave and start taking on mobs of greater difficulty. Something they say about the Shaman directly after this is that in comparison to the Cleric, you won't feel the entire use of your toolkit, but as you progress further, you'll start to notice its usefulness. Shaman is also a fairly capable healer on its own, although if you don't manage your mana well, you'll end up going out of mana pretty quickly and could be out of commission for large portions of the fight. But this would normally only be the case if you're attempting to be the main healer for your group as a Shaman. If you have a Cleric with you, you'll be able to take more of a back seat and focus more on DPS/buffing and debuffing instead of having to ensure that everyone is topped off as much as possible. You'll be able to do things like slowing targets, debuffing their physical attributes, etc. And two things they make clear over the next 20 minutes or so is that firstly, any healer class could act as the main healer if they wanted to, and the areas they're showcasing throughout the stream are not everywhere you'll be able to travel to in the Goblin Cave. There will still be some unknown secrets and pathways you can take that could lead you to greater rewards, or danger. But as far as the healers go, it might require certain class compositions or roles to be filled, but it would be completely possible for any of the final 3 choices to act as a main healer all on their own. For those of us interested in macros, around 1 hour and 10 minutes Minus does a quick showcase of what the macro screen will look like, and around 1 hour and 18 minutes, an example brought up by the team is what you could expect from the weapon technique system when you decide to pair other weapons with specific classes. So for this example, if you're playing a rogue and using mace weapons, you could gain access to different types of CC, such as proning or knocking down an enemy, various types of stuns, things of that nature, and the other people in your party might be able to exploit those setups. And around the 1 hour and 32 minute marker is when they go over the loot they gained from the Rockborn chief they killed, and in this segment the team talks about how they've temporarily introduced level requirements for the gear in testing, and essentially this is just being used right now as a way to simplify the testing process and gain feedback related to how the community reacts to this. And that's essentially everything crucial that was discussed during the stream. At the very end they were able to teleport outside to showcase the difference between the overland and dungeon lighting, and as you can see it's quite literally night and day. But that's all for now folks, thanks so much for watching, and as always, let me know what you think in the comments below. Wale.